You call it standards. I call it emotional walls, keeping you from what your heart truly craves. You set your standards high, but deep down, are you protecting yourself or hiding from love? Have your emotional walls become the fortress that shields you from both hurt and happiness? You say you're looking for someone who meets your standards, but are those standards just barriers you've built? Are you afraid of what's on the other side of your emotional walls, or are you just afraid to let someone in? What if the walls you've built to protect yourself are the same ones keeping love from finding you? We all have our standards, but sometimes the real question is, are those standards keeping us safe or keeping us alone? You've spent so long building emotional walls, but now you've forgotten what it feels like to let someone in. What if the thing you're guarding the most, the thing you call standards, is exactly what's holding you back? Every brick of your emotional walls was laid for protection, but how many of them are just walls of fear? You call it self-respect, but are you really respecting yourself, or are you just afraid to feel vulnerable? How many of your standards are really just masks for unresolved pain that you're too afraid to confront? The emotional walls you've built might protect you, but they also isolate you from the connection you desire. Do your standards help you grow, or do they trap you in a cycle of fear and avoidance? You've convinced yourself your standards are high, but are they really high enough to let love in? What if the emotional walls you think are keeping you safe are actually keeping you trapped in your past? You've set your standards so high, but are you really looking for love or just looking to stay in control? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if your standards are just an excuse to protect a broken heart? Behind every emotional wall is a person longing for connection, but afraid of the vulnerability it demands. You say you want more, but have you considered that your emotional walls are preventing you from getting it? What if the walls you've built are the very thing standing between you and the love you're searching for? You've created a fortress around your heart. How long before the loneliness starts to seep through the cracks? You call it self-worth, but how much of that is really just fear disguised as confidence? What happens when your standards start to feel less like guidelines and more like excuses to shut out love? You tell yourself your walls are to protect you, but what if they're actually the prison that holds you captive? Could your standards be the reason you're stuck in a cycle of longing for something real, but never finding it? You've built walls so high, you can barely see over them, but the view from the top is lonely, isn't it? Have you ever wondered if the walls around your heart are really keeping love away, not just hurt? You set high standards, but could they be the reason you never let anyone close enough to prove their worth? What if the walls you call boundaries are really just a way of hiding from the love you deserve? You've set the bar so high. Are you waiting for someone to reach it? Or are you too afraid to let anyone try? The walls you build aren't just there to protect you, they're a reflection of your own doubts and fears. You say you want a perfect love, but how perfect is it if you're not letting anyone close enough to find out? You tell yourself it's your standards, but what if it's your heart that's really afraid of being broken? Every brick of your emotional walls was placed with care, but now are they holding you up or holding you back? You've guarded your heart so fiercely, but do you even remember what it feels like to let someone in? Your standards are more than just expectations. They're barriers to the connection your heart is longing for. When you stand behind your emotional walls, you're not just protecting yourself from others, you're protecting yourself from love. You've spent so much time building walls, you've forgotten how to live without them. But what happens when you tear them down? Is it really self-respect or just a fear of vulnerability that has you hiding behind your emotional walls? You've created a perfect world of standards and boundaries, but does it still feel perfect when you're alone and in it? The walls you've built are like mirrors. They show you what you want to see, but not what you truly need. You say your walls are there to protect you, but how much protection do you really need if you're already hurting? What if the very walls that seem to keep you safe are the ones making you miss out on everything that could make you happy? You call it emotional intelligence, but how intelligent is it to block love out of fear of what it might cost you? You've set standards, but when was the last time you asked yourself if those standards were serving you or just keeping you stuck? You've built an entire life around your emotional walls, but is that life really yours or just the life of someone afraid to love? Every time you raise your standards, does it bring you closer to love or just further from it? What if your standards aren't really standards at all, but a defense mechanism against the very thing you need the most? You call it self-preservation, but when was the last time you truly let yourself be vulnerable and feel alive? You've locked your heart away behind emotional walls. Do you even know how to love without them? The higher you raise your standards, the more you push love away. What happens when you finally let go of the walls you've built? What if your standards aren't really about finding someone worthy, but about keeping yourself safe from hurt? You think you're protecting yourself by setting high standards, but are you really just preventing yourself from finding happiness? Your emotional walls might keep out the pain, but they also keep out the joy you could be experiencing right now. You've told yourself your walls are a sign of strength, but what if they're really a sign of fear? You're waiting for someone who meets your standards, but are your standards really the reason you're still waiting? You've guarded your heart so fiercely that you've forgotten how to trust it. What happens when you finally do? The walls around your heart are thick, but even the thickest walls can fall. Are you ready to tear them down? You've built your emotional walls to keep you safe, but how safe are you if you're still longing for something more? You think you're protecting your heart, but every brick you lay only makes it harder to feel truly alive. Your walls are a fortress, but how long before you realize that love can't break through stone? You call it independence, but is it really just an excuse to stay isolated from the connection you crave? You've built a strong foundation of standards, but sometimes the strongest walls keep out the best parts of life. Are you protecting yourself from love or protecting yourself from the possibility of heartbreak? You think your standards make you strong, but do they make you strong enough to let love in? The higher you place your standards, the further you push love away. How long can you keep doing this before it's too late? You've put up these walls to protect yourself from pain, but have you ever stopped to wonder what they're keeping out? Your emotional walls are like a cage. You built them to keep out the hurt, but they're keeping you caged in. The higher the wall, the harder it is to see what's on the other side. Is love worth the climb, or are you afraid to find out? You set your standards so high, you forget that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come without any expectations. You think your walls protect you, but what if they're the one stopping you from feeling the connection you need? Each brick of your emotional wall represents a piece of your past. How long will you keep building before you realize it's time to let go? You've surrounded yourself with standards so rigid, you've forgotten what it's like to live without them. You call it self-love, but could it be that your walls are a barrier to the very love you're trying to protect? You've created a perfect bubble of standards and boundaries, but when was the last time you stepped outside of it? What if your walls, built to protect you, are really just a way to keep you from facing your true desires? You keep raising your standards, but with each step higher, do you feel closer to love or more distant from it? You've locked yourself in a room of rules, and now you're wondering why love can't find the door. The stronger your walls, the more you convince yourself that they're necessary. But what if they're the very thing keeping you from the life you want? Your emotional walls may have been necessary once, but now they're just stopping you from growing into the person you're meant to be. You keep your heart safe behind your standards, but what happens when your heart starts to wither in its own prison? You think you're being strong by building walls, but what if true strength comes from letting them fall? You've convinced yourself your walls are essential, but do you realize they might be suffocating the love you want to experience?